Some units are better at harassing your opponent's economy, while there are some units that are complete jokes when it comes to harassment. On this tier list, we'll be discussing on each unit's strength when it comes to harassment. And let's quickly go over what harassment actually is. When I say harassment, I mean the unit's ability to cause economical damage, by destroying buildings, and sometimes even picking off units on the map. But for the most part, this tier list is going to be about destroying buildings. So let's get started already. Our first tier is going to be the useless tier. And just like every other tier list I've done, this tier list also has some units that have almost zero contribution to our goal. These are all the units on our useless tier. And as you can see, most of them don't have anything to do with harassment. The only unit that does have an attack is the fire thrower. But unfortunately for them, they are very unoptimized for this job, and they cost a lot of gold to recruit, so definitely not a good harassment choice. So let's quickly jump into the first actual tier. The bottom tier is going to be the C tier. And our first C tier unit is going to be the Arabian Swordsman. In theory they might not sound so terrible, but if you ever decide to use them as harassment units, you would go broke much quicker than your opponent. Their movement speed and defenses just don't cover up their high cost. They can be a fine unit for fighting in melee, but they're definitely not made for picking off buildings around the map. Our second unit is Tunnelers. Their building damage is fine, their movement speed is really good, but once again, the cost is too high, and the defenses are horrible. These units are mainly used for their ability, not anything else. Next up we have Tower Ballistas. Don't have much to say about them, probably the worst unit in the entire C tier. They're mainly a defensive unit, not a harassment tool. Let's move on to the last C tier unit, the Battering Ram. I mean, have you ever seen someone charging at you with lots of battering rams? It might look goofy for a moment, but each one of them will cost you almost 300 gold, and they get shredded by melee units. And even against ranged units they would somehow get evaporated. Unfortunately for them, they couldn't make it. Let's move on to the next tier. And the first B tier unit is gonna be the good old monks. It's fine to send a few of them here and there, but there's nothing special about using them as harassment units. Unfortunately their movement speed and arrow resistance does hold them back by a lot. So while I do love using monks as combat units, they are definitely the worst light unit at harassing. And there we have Spearmen. While Spearmen and monks are on the same tier, I still believe Spearmen are much better at harassing. Their defenses and cost is the same, if not worse. But the deciding factor is the movement speed. It just makes them considerably more annoying to deal with than monks. And another melee unit, Swordsman. Now once again, they are supposed to be combat units, not harassment units. But it's still funny to throw a few of them against archers, and see how much they struggle to deal with them. So situationally they can be a fine choice, but the movement speed is definitely awful for this task. Let's cover some ranged units now, the Slinger. Now these guys are both fast and cheap, but they lack range and require you to manually attack buildings. They can be used to take out the workers, but they're really easy to clean up. Could be useful, but not my thing. And now the Crossbowmen. These guys are such legendary combat units, but due to lack of movement speed and fire rate, I don't see how they can be used for harassment. You might pretend like you're trying to deal economical damage, but in reality, you have accidentally just killed the entire army, and have won the game. And lastly for B tier, let's go back to Mangonels. As a player, I'm sure you hate these guys, but the AI doesn't seem to mind it that much. I mean, surely it is still a thorn on their side, but it looks like a poison. It's slow, but definitely deadly. Let's move on to the A tier. And this is gonna be the weirdest pick of the history, the Lord. The obvious downside is that you can lose the game if you're not careful. But they are almost immune against arrows, so they can definitely take a lot of buildings before having to retreat. I would say it's a solid choice if you know what you're doing. And the pikemen. Armored units, good movement speed, good building damage, good arrows resistance. They're a great unit for destroying buildings that are near your opponent's castle. Pikemen are such versatile melee units, and they're definitely a good harassment tool as well. The Macemen. Being the fastest infantry unit in the game definitely helps you with this task. And on top of that, they have good arrow resistance, insane melee damage, and can quickly get out of the area if things aren't going their way. The only problem is that it might be too hard to recruit them sometimes. Their speed at taking down building is probably the highest one so far. Anyway, let's move on to the fire ballistas. A high-range siege unit that is capable of setting buildings on fire from a distance. The main reason why it's on A tier is because it can set an entire city on fire from a distance, and it's really hard to stop them. This is such a deadly tool against any player who cares about their economy. And the other A tier siege engine is the trebuchet. This can also be situational, but if you're close enough to your opponent, they can be such a nuisance. They can one-shot most of the buildings in the game, and have insane range. You might want to consider using them in some situations. And our last units are the Arabian archers. Their fire rate is much higher, and have good movement speed if they ever needed to run away. They can be such a pain to deal with sometimes, because they're one of the toughest archers in the game. And now, the best harassment units in the game. Starting with slaves. The cheapest harassment unit in the game, with a really high movement speed. Only one of them needs to reach their production buildings to set an entire city on fire. And another cool thing about slaves is that the quarries would take some time to burn, meaning they would be out of order for some time before going down. Which means the stupid AI would just sit there and watch their quarry burn, instead of doing something about it. The next units are the Giga Chad Knights. I know they are expensive, but you only need a few of them. Even one of them can wreak havoc upon the opponent's space. They are the fastest units in the game, while being armored and having one of the highest damage outputs as well. It takes them forever to die, and they can be incredibly annoying to play against. Next up we have horse archers. If you're looking for an annoying unit, horse archers are the perfect unit for you. You can use small squads of horse archers to roam around the map and kill your opponent's workers. And against enemy units, they are one of the deadliest units in the game, so your opponent has to really think about how to move their units around the map. Now let's talk about catapults. I'm pretty sure it's impossible to make a unit tier list without catapults being on the top tier. We both know how it feels to be harassed by the AI's catapults. It's just so infuriating to always be under catapult fire and lose random buildings to them. And they're the best unit in Stronghold Crusader for a reason. Catapults are insane. Now you might be confused to see normal archers this high on this list. Because both horse archers and Arabian archers outperform them. But what makes normal archers different is the unit cost. If you have Fletchers, you will usually end up recruiting a billion archers, which means you're capable of sending huge hordes of archers everywhere on the map. For that reason, I think European archers are S tier, but don't think they're better than horse archers. And the final unit is the assassin. Because this unit is just freaking insane at taking down buildings. You just need to send tiny squads of assassins to your opponent's base on aggressive stance, and they will automatically chew on your opponent's economy. This unit is by far the best melee unit for dealing economical damage against human players. Usually they won't even see it coming. And as you can see, ranged units aren't even smart enough to deal with them on their own. So your opponent is pretty much doomed against this unit. But that's about it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this list. The units in each tier aren't actually in order, I was too lazy to do that. But the links to tier list will be in the description, and feel free to make your own tier lists in the comments. See you all in the next video.